What was your reason for going to see Dr. Oziel in October of 1989?
Because I was afraid I was going to kill myself.
That was based on how you were feeling?
It was based on how I was feeling, yeah, and the dreams that I was having and just what I was thinking and so on.
What was the type of dream?
Just the fact that I killed myself in the dream and how good it felt. How peaceful and good it felt afterwards.
So you were dreaming about suicide?
Yes.
And were you thinking about suicide when you were awake?
Yes.
And were you having any difficulty in dealing with your family?
Yes. Our difficulty was in being around them not knowing and me not being able to tell them, and it just was very hard for me.
Do you recall, therefore, going to Dr. Oziel's office on October 31st?
Yes.
Do you recall what the first topic was, generally, of your talk with Dr. Oziel on the 31st?
Yes. Basically how lost I felt, the weight I had lost, and what I was planning on doing now.
At some point, did you leave his office and take a walk with him?
Yes, at some point I asked him to go for a walk. I was having trouble telling him about why I was suicidal, since I hadn't told him that I killed my parents. And so he wasn't really getting it. And so I just decided that I needed to tell somebody, and I decided to tell him right then. I really wasn't thinking that clearly. I really wanted him at that point to tell me that I wasn't a bad person and tell me that I wasn't this horrible, terrible person that I was thinking that I was. And he couldn't do that unless he knew that I killed my parents.
During the course of that walk, were you considering telling him?
Yes, I was considering telling him.
Why didn't you just tell him right away?
It was too difficult a thing to just tell him. I was afraid to just tell him.
Do you remember what he said, generally, after you did tell him?
Yes. He said that he thought I was going to tell him this, and that he had suspected this, and that I had no choice but to tell him, and that it was something that I couldn't hold inside of me forever.
Do you know why he was saying those things to you at that time? Had you said anything?
I was just telling him how guilty I felt and how I was having trouble with all of my relatives and them not knowing, and I couldn't have any type of a relationship with anybody.
Did you regret telling him the minute you did or not?
No.
After you told him, did you go back to his office?
Yeah, I started talking to him on the way up about now what I was really feeling suicidal about, and I started going into my dreams and really explaining why I was so depressed.
Did Dr. Oziel start to question you about the shooting of your parents?
Yes. I really wasn't thinking of the consequences, or I wasn't thinking of Lyle. I was just pretty miserable, and so I just decided to tell him.
When he was questioning you about the details, did you tell him some of the details?
Yeah, he asked me how Lyle and I shot our parents. I told him that Lyle and I had walked into the room with 2 shotguns and killed our parents. That's why I felt so guilty, and I told him about what happened before we went to the police, that we had dropped off the guns, that we had been at the theater. He seemed very interested in the details. He cut me off when I was talking about my depression and my suicide. He asked about the guns. He asked me, where did we get these guns? He asked me if we had them in the house, where we got them. I told him that we bought them in San Diego. He asked me why it happened.
Did he ask you at any time who knew about it?
Yes.
When in the sequence did he ask you that?
I think right after, because I had been talking about the fact that guns were on Mulholland, and he asked me why the police hadn't arrested us already if Lyle and I personally bought the guns, and so I told him about what I thought the police knew and who knew what and what the situation was. He asked me if Lyle knew I was here. I said no, Lyle didn't know I was here, and I wasn't sure how I was going to tell Lyle. I hadn't thought about it. So he said, well, how are you going to tell Lyle? And he just kept grilling me about what I was going to tell Lyle, how I was going to tell Lyle, when I was going to tell Lyle. And I said, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't. And he said, no, definitely you should.
Did he decide to do something?
Yes, he got on the phone and called Lyle. He told me that Lyle was coming over.
When he asked you why, what was your reaction to that question?
I wasn't expecting that question. I hadn't even thought about telling him. I hadn't thought about what I was going to say. And it just shook me that he asked me why.
When Dr. Oziel asked you why, did you tell him?
No, I told him I didn't know, because I didn't know how to respond. He was very forceful. He was very aggressive, and he was very interested in all the details and everything about it. And that's not why I was there to talk to him. I was there to try to feel better and talk about how not to kill myself, and that's not what he wanted to talk about.
So when you told him you didn't know why, what did he start saying?
I think he asked me when we started talking about it. He asked me something about when the idea came up, or when it first occurred to Lyle and I, or something like that. I said that Lyle and I had had conversations that week.
Did you tell him the nature of the conversations that you had with your brother that week?
I told him part of the nature of the conversations. I was just really playing it by ear, and I was just trying to go from one sentence to the next, not knowing what I was going to say.
Was there some reason why you didn't want to tell him the truth?
Yes. I absolutely was not wanting to tell him about the sex between Dad and I. I just didn't want to discuss it with him.
Did you want to discuss it with anybody?
No, I wanted to get it away. I was having a lot of flashbacks. I was having a lot of problems dealing with it even after, and I wanted to get away from it.
During the conversations that you actually did have with your brother that week before the shooting, there were conversations about how the family was not close and how you wanted to be close to Lyle. Did you tell Dr. Oziel about that?
Yes.
Did Dr. Oziel know your parents?
Yes, he knew them very well.
And during the time that you were talking to him, was he describing them to you?
He was telling me about my father and why I probably did this. He was telling me that my father was an extraordinarily controlling person. I think he used the word dominating, and basically he was saying that Dad was pretty ferocious and aggressive, and he was saying that nobody could live under those circumstances, and that's probably why I had my confusion.
Did he seem to know your father in the way he described it?
Yes.
And was he putting together characteristics of him?
More than characteristics. I would say he was putting together what he felt my dad was.
And what was your response when he would say these things?
I would agree. At this point, I was waiting for Lyle to come, and I was just letting the conversation flow.